All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CIGI, to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Aaron Schaal. I'm the Chief of Staff and General Counsel here at CIGI, and it's my privilege to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to start off by thanking Wordsworth Books. They're one of our sponsors for our signature lecture series. And I'd also like to thank Waterloo Global Science Initiative for their role in bringing organizations together in Waterloo for this week's public programming that's engaging all ages in discussions about our energy choices. And I think just taking a step back for a moment, the way that we use energy, the way we conceive of energy, and the way that we think about it in the broader framework of climate change is certainly forefront at many people's minds. And the work that this organization is doing is forefront here in the region. As part of that, I think many people here know that it's Earth Week. So tomorrow, leaders from around the world are actually going to gather in New York to sign the Paris Climate Agreement, and Canada's Prime Minister will be among them. So I think it's safe to say that Canada is now back in the game. And as such, tonight, I think it's a really timely and important opportunity for us to reflect on our collective roles and responsibilities meeting the goals of that agreement. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Stephanie Sobek-Swant. Stephanie is the Executive Director of the Rare Charitable Research Reserve, which is a land trust and environmental institute here in Waterloo region. And actually, as an aside, we have one of their beautiful photographs hanging upstairs. So I'm familiar with Rare insofar as some of the great work that they're doing and some of the great photography that's been taken near their premises. It is truly an exceptional place. But Stephanie brings a wealth of both local and international experience on a range of environmental issues. Tonight, she's going to be giving a special presentation on climate, energy, and ecology here in Waterloo region, which, as I said, I don't think could be more topical and more timely. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stephanie to the stage.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Well, as you heard, I'm the Executive Director of Rare Charitable Research Reserve, which is a land trust and an environmental institute. And you will learn more about this later because we're really going to zoom in and look at here our region and what we are doing here with regards to climate change, conservation, energy issues. But I also want to take this a little bit further and make this a little bit bigger and put a little bit of an international lens on this as well. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey tonight. You will hear about arts and science. You will also hear a little bit about my home country, Germany. So I came to Canada in 2008 after I completed my PhD in Germany. And it was really a choice of mine to live here in this region because of all these different great opportunities that we have here, and also because there is some real leadership here with regards to environmental protection, which I am just really personally very drawn to. I grew up in a small mining town in Germany, and I was really lucky because I lived at the edge of town, and almost every day I was able to put my rubber boots out and to go out and poke around in the little hedgerows and forests and fields and ponds. You would see me do that a lot, but unfortunately, it's something that we don't see kids doing that much anymore today because our environment has changed a lot. The place where I grew up has changed a lot. A lot of development has happened, some for the better, some for the worst. And we will look at this a little bit more later as well. But let's jump right into this here and let us talk a little bit about why is conservation important and what can we do. So I'll start, I always like to start this off with showing you the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Because my dear mentor, Brent Sinclair, he and I, we used to teach a class together about the environment and ecology that was geared towards students of the humanities. And he would always start out like this, and I always thought this was a good segue into this. So this is a really famous painting that was being done in 1887 by a painter. I believe his name was Victor Vatsnov. And really what it depicts is this biblical story about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And these four horsemen are symbolic for conquest, war, famine, and death. And really, if you take this in our context, it translates quite readily into habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation, and climate change, which are really quite as intense as conquest, war, death, and all these other things this stands for. And some of this can even lead to that, but more on that later. So, well, all these terms, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, they are all threats. And what they are threatening is biodiversity. And biodiversity is actually really important for us humans. And many people think when they hear about the term, it was first coined in the late 80s, actually, by the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. Often people think, well, that's just species diversity. It's just the different species, the varieties of different species that we find in an area. But it's really much more than that, because biodiversity happens or exists on many different levels. It really starts with genetic diversity, which is the diversity within the individuals of a species, the genetic variability in them. And then, of course, you do have the different species that inhabit a certain area or landscape. But then there's also the ecosystem diversity, which really happens at a landscape level. And an ecosystem really is essentially just the sum of all pieces. It's the community of the species that live in an area, but it's also the physical environment of this area and the interaction between the two. And really an ecosystem can be quite big, like a desert or a forest, or it can be quite small, like, for example, just a pond, or even the organisms that live on our bodies, for example. So why is biodiversity important for us as humans? Well, if you look at this little overview, you can see that biodiversity and these different levels of diversity are really important to make ecosystems work well. So ecosystems usually serve certain functions, and there's a lot of them. Some of them are really quite easy to see and understand, and some of them might be a little bit more obscure. So just to give you some example of what ecosystem functions are, pollination, or the decomposition of waste products of dead organic matter, nutrient cycling, water cycling, climate regulations. Those would all be examples of functions that you can find within an ecosystem. And these usually lead to services that we depend upon as humans. And some of them are really quite obvious. Sometimes we use biodiversity very directly, and it has very direct benefits to us, because we use plant materials, we use fibers, we eat food, we use animal products. But some of them are a little bit more indirect, and this is where these ecosystem functions really play a role. So what are these ecosystem services, these ecosystem functions provide for us? Well, just take pollination as an example. And this picture was actually taken right at Rare, and it shows you a little bumblebee that is probably just about ready to do a good pollination job here. We depend on that for our crop production, for example, or we depend on climate regulation to be able to survive in a climate that we can actually live in. And there are many more examples. We depend on the water cycle to provide us with clean water. We depend on all these ecosystem functions to provide us with healthy soils and nutrients in the soil and clean air. Tying this back into the slide I showed you first about the apocalypse that is impending on us if we continue to use resources the way we have been doing, it really might be an apocalypse soon. And I really want to tie this back to the arts world again too. What you see in this picture is essentially a more modern take 130 years later of the picture you saw on my first slide. Because if you don't look too closely, what you see here is just maybe 4 lone horsemen standing in a river. But if you look a little bit more closely, what this artist here, Jason DeCaires Taylor, really is depicting in his sculpture, The Rising Tide, are again the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And if you look really closely at the head of the horses, you will see these are not normal horses anymore. It's actually a so-called horse head pump that is used to pump oil out of the ground. And they are already standing in the rising waters of here, the Thames River in London, and I think it's a really moving piece of art for me, and really a great expression of some of the issues we might be facing in the future if we continue to keep going as we are going right now. And I really recommend highly to you that you check out his other work as well. He's an artist and a conservationist, and he has done really some fascinating sculptures, in particular, some of them in marine parks on the ground of the ocean, and it's really a quite fascinating work, in my opinion. So every time climate change comes up, you will usually find at least one person who says, oh, I don't believe all this talk, this is all not real. I can tell you it's real, people. So this is a paper that I believe came out just this past week, and where researchers actually did a meta-analysis of the literature that is available on climate change right now and on global warming. And they came to the conclusion that there's actually almost 100% consensus in the literature that the global warming effects that we see right now are human-induced. So there is really no doubt. And so what are these effects that we're seeing, and where's some of the denial sometimes coming from? Well, the Earth is a globe, and we have an atmosphere and atmospheric gases that surround it. And in a way, this is really good, and we need that, because otherwise we would just be an icy rock floating in space like many other planets, because we need the atmosphere that we do have to, it's a little bit of an insulating blanket around us, because we need the heat of the sun and the energy of the sun to survive. All living beings on the planet need this. But what unfortunately happened since the industrial age is we artificially, through our behaviors, through using of fossil fuels, really artificially increased this insulating layer of gases. So what was a helpful thin blanket before is more like a big down-packed sleeping bag at this point. And we have increased really the amount of these gases, such as CO2, by about 42%, I believe. And that's a big problem, because it means a lot of the heat from the sun that we do need is not reflected back anymore. It's getting trapped around us. And this leads to the effects that we are already seeing today that we know as common effects of global warming. It leads to rising temperatures, it leads to rising sea levels, it leads to pole caps and glaciers melting. It leads to all sorts of strange phenomena that you see outside. Plants flowering earlier, birds coming back earlier. It leads to an increased incidence of extreme weather events, for example. And there are many more issues that are related to this, and these are big issues that we need to resolve somehow. So the current refugee crisis is in the newspapers everywhere at the moment. And there's thousands of people leaving Syria because there's a war going on in there. And it's a real big problem. But if you think this is a big problem, just think again, because it's only going to get worse. Climate change will most likely affect so many people on this globe that we will start to see large migrations, because there will be areas that will become uninhabitable if we continue to keep going. So there are statistics out there that will tell you that 265 million people will face a decrease in the growing season in the next 40 years already. That is pretty soon, in my opinion. And what this really means is there will be a lack of food. And if there is a lack of food, people will get unhappy really quickly, because obviously we depend on this. Our whole well-being depends on being able to sustain ourselves. So what this will likely result in is we will see millions of migrants that are being displaced by climate change, and there's possibly also more conflict breaking out over these issues. And it's interesting if you talk to people and if you work in the environmental field, because there are still people who often quite understand just how big of a part we are of the environment and how much we depend on it, and who will tell you, oh, I'm more interested in social justice causes. But really, the environment and climate change, in my opinion, is one of the ultimate social justice causes, because there will be no peace in this world unless we can resolve these issues. So Well, this all sounds very grim, I know, but is there hope at the end of the tunnel? Well, if you ask me personally, I would say there definitely is. We have made some progress, and people are coming together and realizing this really is a big problem, and we all have to step up and work together to solve this somehow. And you all know this past December was the big COP21 climate conference in Paris, where I believe 196 nations signed up to really start hopefully walking the talk on this. And there were some big goals that were being set there. There were goals such as wanting to limit the increase in temperature to under 2 degrees, or maybe even under 1.5 degrees, and to be carbon neutral by the end of this century. So these are big goals, and I think we cannot just rely on the governments to make it happen. We as communities really have to step up and do our piece and make sure that we can follow up on these ambitious goals that have been set. So I kind of want to take you a little bit across the pond and home to my native Germany. So most of you will probably know this lady here. It's Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And she's been in the news a lot too right now because of the refugee crisis. But she has been in the news recently for another thing as well, which is what we call Energiewende. And what Angela really likes to say a lot is, wir schaffen das, which means we can do it. And there's an interesting backstory to this. I think all of you will remember the Fukushima disaster that happened in 2011. So we Germans, we are people, we like to rally if we don't like things. So what happened after Fukushima is lots of people got on the streets and really rallied against nuclear power in Germany. And they really pressured the government to phase out nuclear power. And only 3 months after the Fukushima disaster happened, the government really stepped up and said, yes, we're going to phase out nuclear power in Germany within the next 10 years. So that was a really bold move. And on first sight, it might seem, well, does this really make sense? Because this is kind of a carbon-free energy choice. So what are we going instead? So this is called the Energiewende, or energy transition or energy transformation, if you want to translate it to English. So how did this all come to be, and what does this really mean at the end of the day? Well, being a child of the 1980s, the fear about nuclear power is nothing new to me. In 1986, I was 8 years old when the big Chernobyl disaster happened, and I remember all too vividly that all of a sudden it was not okay anymore to go out and play in the sandbox, and all of a sudden you had to really watch where your milk was coming from that you were drinking. And all of a sudden we went into the grocery store and there were mushrooms from Eastern Europe that were dirt cheap because no one would buy them anymore. It had so many effects, directly and indirectly, of how I grew up. And I also grew up seeing this sticker a lot, which says Atomkraft, nein danke, which essentially means nuclear energy, thanks but no thanks. So there was a big movement towards the late 70s and in the early 80s where people already started to rally and felt there was too much of a risk associated with nuclear power, and there's too much of an issue with the waste and the way how it is not economic sustainable and has to be subsidized and all these things, that people were really against it. But it took about 3 decades for the government to step up and to start phasing out nuclear power. But really, what you also start seeing now in Germany is this, because part of the goals that came out of this energy transition, the Energiewende, were really that nuclear power is not going to be replaced with coal-fired plants, but we're going to get rid of the coal-fired plants as well. And this is really interesting because it really led to the effect that the research and the movement in the entire society stepped up to move towards using renewables almost exclusively as soon as possible. And there are some really, really big targets that have been set. Germany used to depend for 20% of its power on nuclear power. We had 17 nuclear power plants in 2011. 9 of them have already been switched off, so there's still some way to go. But generally speaking, the use of renewables has much increased since this decision was made. And in fact, there was a day in this past year, July 25th, where the wind was so good and the sun was shining that for several hours, Germany was able to draw 45, almost 3/4 of its energy from renewable energy. And I didn't bring you a map, but if I had brought you a map, you would see that particularly in the northern areas, you will have a lot of windmills, and in the more southern areas, you will have a lot of solar panels. And interestingly, so some of these targets being set is that by 2050, renewables should contribute about 80% to the energy that's being used in Germany. And also around the same time, there is some work being done to ensure that the energy consumption in itself will go down as well, by 20% by 2020, and then by 50% in 2050. And similar targets have been set for carbon emissions themselves, and this is where the coal plants come into play. So what you can also see if you drive around in Germany, which I recently did in this past year, when I was visiting my dad for the first time after 7 years of being here, is these solar parks. But this is a picture that was actually taken in Spain. In Germany, they will look a lot different because a lot of them are a fair bit smaller. And this is an interesting part of this whole movement too, because so far the 4 big energy companies in Germany have only contributed about, I believe, 6.5% towards these renewable energies. But a lot of this is really a grassroots movement. And there's a lot of micro-scale economy going on, where on a small scale, individual farmers will have 1 windmill, for example, or will just have a few solar panels. So about 80% of these renewables so far are really driven, or the capacity is owned by the community, either by individuals or by smaller groups of the community. And this is really important because it means there's buy-in. And if you look at the current statistics, it shows that about 90% of the people are happy that this is happening. They are completely in favor of the Energiewende and this transition. And this is because there is buy-in. And it's important because this is not going to be easy and it's not going to be cheap. So the energy bills are definitely going up for the time being. And that's really something the community has to buy in, or it just won't work. So when we look at this picture, it really demonstrates quite nicely one issue that often comes up when we speak about renewables and renewable energy. They take up space, and there are ways to mediate this. If we do put solar panels on rooftops, for example, I think that's a perfect use of space. With large solar parks and wind parks, it can be a little bit more of a problem. So there has to be a balance, because there is only so much space left in this world, and we want to use it for many different things. We have a growing population. We have to house people somewhere. We need agriculture because we need to feed people too. We have to make sure that we have space for these renewable energies. But we also have to make sure that we preserve natural spaces, because this is really tying back to where I started out in the beginning, and to this biodiversity that we need to preserve. And this is a really nice segue into the next part of my talk, where I talk a little bit more about why do we need conservation? Why is conservation important? So I brought you this little cartoon, and after hearing me talk for a while now, you should understand this already. We haven't been treating this planet particularly well, so it's time that we change this. And not just during Earth Week or Earth Day tomorrow. Really, it should become our new mantra, that we really take good care of our planet. So what does this mean, and what are the most basic principles of conservation? Well, I talked a little bit about land use, and really if you look at the landscape and if you look at an aerial photograph, you will see it's a mosaic. It's very patchy. And for natural areas, this is actually a bit of a problem, because in this case, size does matter. If you preserve habitat in a natural area, you want to make this area as large as possible. And there are several reasons for that. So really what you see in this picture here is one large area is always better than just one small one or even several small ones. And one big, large, contiguous area is still better than the same space with a lot of little patches. And what's also good is if you can even connect this area. So for ecological integrity and for protecting and preserving biodiversity, connectivity really also plays a really large role in addition to size. So why is that? Well, obviously, there are species who really do need a lot of space and a lot of resources and a lot of other species to survive and to sustain themselves and to live. And they need this corridor and this connectivity and the corridors to be large enough to as well provide food and shelter and all these things to roam around. And so one term that we often use in ecology is the so-called edge effect. And this is what you see in the right half of this graph here. When you have a large patch size and a large habitat, the amount of edge, the amount of exterior space is comparably small to the interior space, which is big. But the more you fragment the landscape and the more you get smaller habitat patches, the larger this edge gets in comparison to the interior part until you get to what's depicted here in point C, where you have virtually no interior left, and it's all driven by these edge effects. And what are these edge effects? So what this really means is a habitat is not homogeneous. It differs depending if you're on the edge on it or if you're in the center of it. So around the edge, conditions are usually much harsher. A lot of the fragmentation happens because there's, for example, roads and railways that we use. So at the edges of this, your plant composition will be different because the temperature, the microclimate will be different. It's more exposed to the elements. It's often more exposed to pressures from invasive species as well. It generally is a much harsher environment usually than the interior. And some species really depend on these more, I would call them more pure conditions in the interior to survive. And even though you see a lot of wildlife around roadsides, for example, raccoons or deer or red-tailed hogs, which is all great, these are all considered edge species or exterior species because they can deal with this habitat condition because they are very generalist. They don't have very specific needs necessarily. But if you look at species that are a lot more rare, for example, bobcat, or if you look at birds like wood thrushes or bobolink, you will find that they really prefer and need the interior. You don't find them around these edges, and for that reason, you need a large area that you protect. So how does this relate to the work that I'm doing here in the region? Well, let me explain you a little bit who we are and what we do at REA. So you learned already in the beginning that we are a land trust and an environmental institute. But what does that really mean? So essentially a land trust is an organization that owns and stewards conservation lands on the behalf of the community. And really this pure conservation is the key part of our mission. We want to protect the conservation lands that we own intact and in perpetuity for the community to enjoy. And this includes not just the community right here, right now, but also future generations. And our method of conservation that we use at REA is what we call the chain of learning. And then we'll talk a little bit in detail about that later. But kind of in a nutshell, what that means, our real priority project at REA is research. We do environmental research and ask really burning applied questions that apply to conservation and that are really broad and include not only ecology, but also bringing social science and the humanities and arts and psychology and archaeology, because the environment really is not just the natural environment, it includes the cultural and the built environment as well. To ask these really burning questions questions that help us as conservation practitioners to make better management and make better conservation decisions. And all of this really feeds back into our education programming as well, so that the whole community can become part of this and learn about these things. So this shows you a map of the property that we currently own here in Waterloo region. And what you can see, everything that's contained within these yellow borders is conservation property that RARE owns. And what you can also really see nicely in this aerial photograph is what I alluded to earlier, this fragmentation or this mosaic that we see in the landscape. Because as you can see, even though the area that RARE owns right now is really large, it's over 900 acres, just very close to us along the edges of the Grand River, there's a lot of urbanization, there's a lot of other land uses for resource extraction, for example, there's agriculture, so it's this whole patchwork that I described earlier today. And we have 900 acres of conservation lands right smack in the middle, which is, we're so lucky that we have that, because if you consider that already 559,000 people live in Waterloo region, and we are projected to grow by another 1/3 or so in the next few decades, this is a real national treasure to have. And I will tell you a little bit more about why this is the case. So, why protect RARE? Why have so many people made an investment in this charity? We were first founded in 2001, and since then we have gained more than 2,000 supporters. And really, if you ask some people, they will tell you, as we have seen, RARE is located at the Grand River. RARE is all about the water, and water really plays a very important role in our ecosystems. So that is very true. But there is more to it than just that. So this shows you a map of Waterloo region as a whole. And what I have pulled out there in this little pink circle is the area where RARE is located. So you see, RARE already owns a large chunk, but if you look at this map, you will also see that there are more green spaces in the region. And what we're currently working on together with many other organizations in this region is to really have a good look at this map and see, are there other areas that we can protect and secure going forward? How can we best do that with regards to ecological integrity? And in particularly, we are looking at habitat complexity and significance of habitat and areas that are already existed and already protected, such as RARE or such as some of the GRCA conservation areas. And how can we start to make these green corridors across the map? How can we start adding on to them, and how can we start connecting them? And we are quite lucky, I personally find, in this region, because we have over 70 environmental organizations. So there's a lot of grassroots momentum here that can be used for such efforts, and a great community that really feels strongly about these causes. And we also have a really good layer of protection from the municipal governments and from the regional government with our environmental significant landscape designations, which the area where RARE is located is part of, and which are these large areas that you see enclosed there on the map. Essentially what that means is there are very strict rules on what types of development can happen in these areas and how that would look like and what can't happen, which I think is very important to have. So, but looking a little bit at the map again of the property that RARE currently owns. So this is a bit of a simplified version. We have really over 24 different habitat types at RARE. Some of them are depicted here in this picture. So you can see we have still fairly large areas of forest, but we have also marshlands and meadows and some agricultural land. And let me tell you a little bit more about these different types of habitat that you can find at RARE. Well, first of all, along the Grand River, and also not just immediately at the shore, but a little bit more inland, we find limestone cliffs. And these limestone cliffs are very unique in this region. They are very similar in appearance to what you would otherwise find, for example, at the Niagara Escarpment. And they are really quite unique habitats because they come with a very unique community of plants, particularly ferns and mosses, that you wouldn't find anywhere else gulls. And we also have a very mysterious habitat that not a lot of people know, which is called alver. So alvers are really globally rare. And in this region, they are particularly rare, and you can only find them at rare, no pun intended. So alvers, I always like to describe them, they are almost like a rock baron. There's very shallow soils, and you hit the bedrock almost instantaneously if you start digging. So what this means, they are really quite harsh and quite exposed to the elements. It gets really cold in winter and really hot in summer. So this again means there has to be a very special and unique community of plants and animals that can endure these types of conditions. And we find these here right in the region. So then we have a patch of old-growth forest. And this is a real treasure, because old-growth forest is globally so rare. We humans have interfered and exploited most of the forest really that we find around the globe, and particularly in densely urbanized areas such as the region, there is only less than 0.1% left of this type of forest. To be a true old-growth forest, it really has to be undisturbed for at least 120 years. So that's, in our rapidly developing context, a fairly long time and fairly significant. And you really find trees in this forest that are more than 250 years old. And this I find is really amazing, and it's really something that I want my children to see and to enjoy as well. And coming back to the water, so Rhea is located right at the confluence of the Grand and Speed River. And this is actually really important because it's a very popular and important staging area for birds during migration times. Because it usually doesn't freeze in winter, so it means it's also a food resource for waterfowl that come through the area. And of course, if you have the river, you also have the floodplain. And the floodplain, I find, is really fascinating because it's really where you find some of these creatures like the snapping turtle that we see here. And some of these guys can be so surprisingly big. I was wandering around all day, one day in the floodplain, and I saw what I thought was a large rock, and all of a sudden it moved and was looking at me, and it was this giant snapping turtle. And it's just so great that we can still see this in these areas here, because unfortunately in Germany, for example, the only species of turtle we had there died out long ago before I was even born. So speaking of all this conservation and protection of natural habitats and species and land, I always like to make a point that Rhea has lands that are still in agricultural production. And we are intending to keep it that way. Because if you read some of the statistics, they can be pretty scary. The Ontario Farmland Trust, for example, is telling me that within 20 years, Ontario gets entirely dependent on outsourcing all of our food. And this is just something we don't want to have happen. And for this reason, we have always made a point that agriculture and local, healthy, organically grown food should always be part of our mission and part of Rhea as well. Because food is something people intrinsically relate to because we need it to survive. And it's a really good way to connect to conservation if you understand to actually be able to grow food. You need pollination, you need the healthy air and clean water and clean soils. So these people here staying at the edge of one of our hay fields are our bird monitors. And what they are looking at are these little guys. So this is bobolink. Bobolink is a species at risk in Ontario. And they really require a very special management of grassland habitat. So if you have a hayfield, you really shouldn't mow it before July 15th. Usually it's a little bit of give and take, sometimes depending on the weather, because these guys breed in there and they need the hay to be intact for that. So this is one of the animals you can find in Rhea. And if you listened closely earlier, I mentioned bobolink as one of these species that are really dependent on large areas areas and that are depending on the interior. They don't like the edge habitat at all. And this is a space that we can provide for these birds. And of course, if you speak about birds, you really can't get away without talking the iconic bald eagle. And we see those guys at rare as well. Thankfully, the situation has gotten better. They were getting close to the decline about a decade ago, I want to say. And they are back. And they hunt at the river, particularly in winter. We have hiking trails that are free and open to the public usually. There's one trail that we close over winter because we don't want to disturb the bald eagles. So we really make sure, yes, the community should enjoy these areas, but there are areas, some of them that are so sensitive that there has to be a little bit of management. And in total, we find about 78% of the bird species that you can find in all of Waterloo region, you can see at rare. And I really would like to show you this picture because this too refers to one of the species I mentioned earlier today. And if you think it looks a little bit like a scratching post, I can confirm with you that's exactly what we think it is. And this may have been caused by a bobcat. And bobcat, again, is one of these interior species that needs a lot of space to roam and to hunt. And while we haven't been able yet to trap one on camera, we keep on trying. And you can find, I believe, about 70% of the mammal species of all of Waterloo region at rare. And the same is true for the amphibians and reptiles as well. We have actually even 80% of the species you can see in the region at rare. And same with plants. Usually you find a lot of them. We have almost 600 species, which is about half of what you can see in the region. So tying this back to community engagement, because I mentioned earlier today that really it takes a whole community to make these big changes happen that we need to see. So in the past year alone, we planted over 1,600 trees at rare, and it's always good to do that because we have very little canopy cover left, and you heard we have very little old growth forest left in particular. But at the same time, there too has to be a little bit of a balance because we want to have a nice matrix of different habitat types that are not just forest, because that's how you really increase biodiversity, because different species depend on different habitats for their survival. But thankfully, all these stewardship actions that we do with the help of the community. And we have hundreds of volunteers every year who help us with these efforts. And it's really a place where you can come and where particularly kids can come and still get their hands dirty and really immerse you in this. So coming back to rare as the Environmental Institute, research is a big priority in our mandate. And it really is the start of the chain of learning. So at the beginning of our chain of learning really is a researcher and a research project. So in the past decade, we had over 50 different research projects that happened at rare. Over 12 different universities or other organizations, research institutes worked together with us on doing research on a variety of different questions. And now we are increasingly building more expertise on staff as well to ask our own burning questions that we need to have answered as practitioners. For example, how do we best deal with invasive species is a very applied question, and there are a lot of opinions out there, but there's not all that much research out there yet on what is best going forward. And having a place like rare that is protected intact and in perpetuity for forever and ever is really important for this, because a lot of environmental research questions you have to ask at a really long-term temporal scale. It sometimes takes decades, particularly if you do monitoring, to see patterns emerge. It's often not very imminent. It's not questions that you can address in a year or two. And this is really, really important, and the researchers have been really appreciative of rare providing a space for this. Part of our research is actually energy related too, because what we also find at RARE is North House. So I want to give you a really brief and quick little virtual tour of what North House is. So North House is actually a $4 million research investment by the University of Waterloo. So the Team North, which was made up of these students from UW, and the prof you see in the picture there, David Lieberman, and also teams from Ryerson University and Simon Fraser University, built this unique solar house and living lab for the Solar Decathlon in Washington, D.C. in 2009. So this was a project that was run here in Waterloo by the School of Architecture and the engineering department. And the Solar Decathlon happens, I believe, every 4 years or so. And hundreds of student projects apply, but only 20 of them are invited to actually build a prototype. So this group was invited to do that, and it was on display, I believe, for a week in Washington, D.C., together with 19 other solar houses. So there are 20 in total, and it's a competition, and they compete in these 10 different categories. So the result of this was that North House actually came in on first place. And they lost a little bit of marks because they had a TV running in the house, which was using too much energy, which is unfortunate. But they came in first place in the education section. So, and what North House really is, it's a house that has solar panels all on the roof, but also on the southeast and western side of the house. It has these large window panes, which allow for passive solar heating as well. And it also has a system on the roofs that allows for the solar heating of water and of space heating through this heated water. And it's really a fascinating design and function that came together here. So what you see in this picture is a little bit of the interior. And if you ever want to come out to RARE and have a tour, you can either book them, or we host them quite frequently. And it's really interesting to see this building, because the window panes in itself were the biggest that could actually be fabricated at that date and time. And they are quadruple glazed, so it's glass, and then you have 2 mylar films and krypton gas in the center, which really leads to the effect that they are almost as insulated as a wall would be. They are not like regular glass. What you also cannot see here in this picture, but there are very nice marble laminate floors in there, but underneath is a phase change material. It's kind of paraffin cells that have a salt hydrate material, which turns into a liquid during the day when the house warms up. And then overnight, as it changes its phase to a solid again, it can release this heat, this solar energy that was stored in there, and provides nice warmth and nice warm floors. And it just really looks beautiful to the way it was designed. So what you see here actually is a different picture of the kitchen. And I always like to point out the backsplash. And the backsplash is not only decorative, but those lines you can see there, they actually start to glow brighter the more energy the house produces, and the more energy is preserved, and the more water is preserved. And you can also program it to set it to your own community goals and make it grow brighter the more you approach your goals, which I think is a really cool idea. But what North House also is, it's a space where researchers can come and they have a real-time facility to test out new technologies and new building technologies that could come to market and that would help us to preserve energy. But what it also is, it's one of Waterloo Region's nicest living rooms. We currently have an artist in residence, Macarda, living there, who is connecting to North House and to energy and to the property, and her art is being influenced by that. But we also had 2 writers in residence staying there already. And at the end of these residences, there's always a show or a reading, and the community is invited to participate in this. And it's so fascinating on how these artists are able to communicate to us their relationship and the meaning they draw from these lands and these projects at RARE. Tying this back into the education, I spoke that I said earlier that the research projects are really the beginning of our chain of learning. So we have curriculum-based school programs, and we have also summer and March break day camps that we run. So kids as young as JK can come to us, and they can learn about the environment. And they come to North House as well and learn about energy, because there are energy magnet programs at the schools, but they don't have very many sites in the region at all where they can come to do field trips, but Rare is one of these sites. And I really want to kind of wrap this talk up to show you a little bit more about our education programs. I really just want to let those pictures speak for themselves to some degree, because just look at these kids and how they really use the outdoors as a hands-on classroom to get immersed in the environment. And just look at these faces and the fascination, this curiosity that kids really have. They so intrinsically know that we are part of the environment and how important this is for us. And then as we grow up and become distracted, many of us lose this. And Rare is really a place where we can make this connection again, and where we can foster this connection and start training the next generation of conservationists. Because we need them, because all of us eventually are going to be gone, and we want our kids to carry this on, what we started. And we want them to become the next generation of the responsible stewards of our land. And really, part of this is being about being a healthy community as well. We spend so many hours these days in front of screens, and Rare is really a place where everyone can come out and can be outside and be in nature. And there is so much research out there that really shows how this in itself is a service that an ecosystem and biodiversity provides to us, and how important this is for us for our overall health and mental well-being as well. And clearly, as I said, research is such a high priority at Rare. We also give children the opportunity to experience research hands-on. And this is really important because there's a lot of pseudoscience out there, and a lot of people, and children in particular, are confused. What is this information I see on the internet? Is this real? And it's really important to train the next generation as well to ask critical questions and to think critically and to engage and be able to ask these questions. And this is really something that we foster at Rare as well. So I want to finish this off with thanking you and also putting the question out there back to you. What is Rare to you? What do you think we can do to carry on this work? And what do we need to do to see something happen like we see in Germany with the Energiewende here in Canada? And I would really like to invite you as well to all come out, visit one of our events sometime, or just go for a hike on the Rare property. I would really love to see all of you out there and to learn more. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you. So there's now a period of time that has been set aside for questions. This was being webcasted as well, so I see there's already a question coming in from Julie in Waterloo. She's asking, what are other municipalities in Ontario and Canada doing the same or differently than Rare? How do you share knowledge with other land trusts? Oh, this is a very good question. There's, of course, a lot of other organizations who are focused on conservation. I think the main difference for Rare as an environmental institute and a land trust really is we don't just own land and set it aside. We invite the community to become part of this. We don't put up fences around it. We want to ensure that the community can connect to it and understand what's going on there. And really, research as a priority is something that we do very uniquely, and what you usually don't find, for example, in the conservation areas that the conservation authorities run. And there are other great organizations such as the Nature Conservancy of Canada, for example, which is very much focused on really preserving very sensitive habitat. But everyone has a little bit of a different focus, and our focus at RARE really is very much on research and science and connecting the community to this part of this. So how do we share knowledge with other land trusts? So we are part of OLTA, the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, which is sort of the head organization of all the land trusts in Ontario. So we frequently meet with people from other land trusts, learn about what they are doing, let them know what we are doing. They can learn from us. There's meetings, there's conferences. We're now part of a really great group that is funded by the Gosling Foundation, for example. It's called the Community of Practice Better Organizations for Nature. There are 6 different land trusts that are part of this and share information and knowledge and tools around engagement organizing. So there's all sorts of different ways how we work together with other groups, and particular as part of this larger land securement strategy that we're working on, we're working with a lot of organizations here in the region, such as Waterloo Region Nature, also other provincial organizations such as Ontario Nature, who all play a role in this. Any other questions? Yes. Fred.
Hi, my name is Fred Kuntz. Thank you. That was very inspiring. I think a lot of people in Waterloo region don't know about RARE, which is surprising because it's so large. I mean, everyone in Toronto has heard of High Park, but this is much larger, and it's still a mystery to so many people.
Yeah, it's actually larger than Central Park in New York, for example. And we own the same amount of property many other land trusts own, for example, but it's very unique because it's all connected. It's all one large piece right now, which actually makes it even more significant and more important based on what we've learned earlier today.
So my question is about who pays for RARE? Like, where does the money come from? How do you raise money, and can people donate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier today, we have over 2,000 supporters already who have made donations to RARE. And really, RARE is primarily funded by individual donations. So we are a registered charity, and more than 85% of the funds that we have coming in are community donations, and this is really important to us. It gives us a lot of flexibility too, because we're not so dependent on government funding that may be cut all of a sudden off one day. And this is a really great opportunity too for everyone to again engage in this and become part in this and take real ownership. In particular, as we are looking to acquire more land and pay off the remainder of the lands that we already own, we are launching a Turn the Map Green campaign where every school kid even can, on the map, go online and pick a square meter and for just $2 symbolically adopt this square meter and really feel ownership of this project in this way as well. Okay, we have another question coming in from the webcast, which is from Sam in Waterloo, who's asking, what do you recommend for parents to get their children interested in ecosystems and biodiversity and not just their tablets? Well, this is a really great question. And of course, I'm going to say, make sure that teachers know about us and that they can come on a field trip to RARE and sign them up for camp. But there are also things that you can really easily do at home. And even if you live in a fairly urbanized area. So I myself have a 4-year-old girl, and of course she is interested in my computer and in my tablet. But we also have a lot of birdhouses, and we plant native plants, and we plant veggies in our garden, and that's just something she is really interested in because she can get hands-on involved and she can learn the different backyard bird species that are coming in, and that's really the first important step, I think. And it's also important not to be a helicopter mom. It's okay to get dirty. It's okay for them to run around outside and to play outside. The world is not all bad out there. That's, I think, is just an important thing to remember. Has another question there?
Hello, my name is Hartmut Kaiser. Es freut mich außergewöhnlich, dass Sie bei uns in der Region gelandet sind. My question is this: the time very soon we will see dandelions take over the landscape, fields, every lawn, everything they possibly can, which seems to be prevalent in Ontario, but out in the West, I didn't see that so much. Also in Germany, to make a comparison there, you see a lot of naturally growing meadows with all kinds of grasses and wildflowers that are growing all by themselves. And we don't see that here in our area at all. What are the differences?
Yeah, I think, you know what, sometimes I think Germany just learned its lesson a little bit more quickly because there's a lot less space there, generally speaking. And it came to the point where the landscape was so overused that it became clear this is almost the point of no return, and something had to be done to preserve those spaces or to bring them back at least. I think what we see here right now is a bit of a similar phenomenon. We have used a lot of the space, but we are realizing this now, and we're bringing it back to where it was, or at least we try that, and we restore these spaces and these meadows and forests that we have taken out before.
Hi there. I recently read the Regional Official Plan 2015 for the region of Waterloo and the municipalities. And in it, they use all the right buzzwords: sustainability, renewable resources, alternative forms of energy, for things around housing, affordable housing, all that sort of thing. I tried to ask them what they were actually doing to implement this or encourage municipalities to adopt that, and they really didn't have an answer. They've just, I think they need a lot of help in that area. The municipalities tend to be very archaic in the types of permits, bylaws, and policies that they have, and I think they're a bit stuck in terms of how to move forward. So I'm just wondering how you can maybe, or we as a community can maybe encourage them to kind of relook at some of those policies where there are individuals that want sustainable living, that want eco-friendly homes, tiny homes, for instance. Their only solution to that, as far as I can tell, is to build vertical and to just have people living in apartments and high-rises and still encourage like big developments, big home development, that sort of thing, which I don't think is sustainable, in my opinion. What would be your response to that?
I think I would agree with you. It's really important that we make sure the government knows what is it that we want, what is it that people want, and it's important to garner this support and this grassroots support in particular, and to not operate in isolation, and to go to the governments and to be in their face exactly what happened in Germany after the Fukushima disaster, for example. I think that's very important because it does take a community to make that happen. And we are all responsible for being a voice for that as well. We cannot sit and wait for it to be prescribed by the government. It has to come bottom up more than top down, in my opinion. It's great if it's coming from the top down as well, but it needs this whole community to make that happen.
Would there be anything you'd suggest? Because I have tried to speak to various people at the municipality, and other than being polite and giving you maybe a half hour of their time, they don't really seem to have any motivation to make any changes, or maybe they don't have the political will, or maybe, I'm just not really sure.
I can't really speak to that, but what I would suggest is there's always the option to present to council as well. There's always the option to join one of these many groups that we have in the region and to garner people power in numbers. It's always better to have a lot of voices than just being one voice, right?
Hi, my name is Jack Redmond. Very good talk. In 1974, the region had a committee. Bob Dorney, an environmentalist, was part of that committee, and our main focus was an attempt to get the University of Guelph lands into something like RARE. So it's really great that it did occur. In terms of how it's operating now, do you have any problems with invasive species in terms of woodlots? And also, are you looking at connections with any other areas like Crespin Woods or Pinnacle Hill, or down further south in terms of the rapids, et cetera, that would show that RARE is just part of a centralized area?
Yeah, so absolutely, invasive species are virtually everywhere at this point, and we're struggling with that as well. So a large part of the work our land management team is doing with the volunteers is actually removing invasive species. There's garlic mustard, there's giant hogweed, there's Phragmites. We're trying to keep our foot on it and to make sure it's not getting any worse than it is. But this has been a phenomenon that has been going on for a while now, and every organization is struggling with this. It's a real big problem that we really need to deal with before it becomes overwhelming and before these invasive species start to choke out the native species that we want to see. And to the other part of the question, yes, we're absolutely taking a really good close look at the map and see what is there on the ground with regards to where are we located in the landscape and how can we make sure we connect in a meaningful way based on the landscape ecology and the greater matrix of the landscape. Thank you. Oh, we have one more question coming in from the webcast. Maybe we do that as the last question. So what kind of government advice or advocacy does RARE get involved in at the municipal, provincial, and federal level? That's Thomas from Cambridge. So advocacy is not part of our core mandate. What I really like to see us do more in the future going forward is use the research and science that is being conducted at RARE to inform policy and to really start working at the policy level. This being said, of course, we meet with government representatives. We tell them about RARE, we tell them about the work that we're doing. We educate about the importance of it, and we seek out this dialogue as often as we can do. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for such an inspiring presentation. While you were talking, it made me think of a saying that I'd heard a few days ago, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something to the effect that we don't inherit the planet from our parents, but we borrow it from our children. And I've got a 4-year-old at home too, and when I heard that, it really kind of tugged on my heartstrings. But I think it's important to realize that this is a truly, it's a global phenomenon that we're dealing with. The way the planet looks now is not the way it's going to look 20 years from now, and the choice is really up to us. So I'm encouraged by the fact that there's groups like RARE doing the important work that you're doing. So thank you very much for everything that you're doing. I suppose before we adjourn tonight, I'd like to make just a couple of quick kind of housekeeping comments. The first is the video from tonight's presentation will actually be edited and up on our website in a few days. So if you would like to share it or you'd like to see it again, it will be there. So feel free to come visit our website and share the link through your social media networks. And then secondly, if you enjoyed tonight, we do have a few other events that I'd like to let you know about coming up in the near future. The first, you would have seen the ad for it playing when you came in. There's a movie called Watchers of the Sky. It's won a number of different awards, and it's about the life and times of Raphael Lemkin. And he was important for a number of different reasons, but he's actually the fellow who coined the term genocide. And he believed that law could protect the world from mass atrocities. So it's a fairly powerful piece of cinema, and it's definitely worth watching. And that will be this coming Monday, April 25th at 7 p.m. So I invite you to come back and join us for that. As well, we're honored to be hosting His Excellency Bruce Heyman, who's the United States Ambassador to Canada, and he'll be giving a free public lecture here, again, at the CIGI Auditorium, and that's Wednesday, May 4th at 11 a.m., and they say there's no such thing as free lunch as well. This time there actually will be, so there's a lunch that will be served on May 4th, so please join us for that, and come and see the Ambassador from the United States. And finally, if you liked what you saw tonight, please feel free to reach out online, sign up for our newsletter so that you get updated regularly on all the great things that we're doing here at CIGI. And finally, I'd like to ask you again to help me thank our speaker tonight, who I think made some very powerful and interesting remarks and taught me a lot about RARE. So thank you very much.
And you will learn more about this later because we're really going to zoom in and look at here our region and what we are doing here with regards to climate change, conservation, energy issues. But I also want to take this a little bit further and make this a little bit bigger and put a little bit of an international lens on this as well. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey tonight. You will hear about arts and science. You will also hear a little bit about my home country, Germany. So I came to Canada in 2008 after I completed my PhD in Germany. And it was really a choice of mine to live here in this region because of all these different great opportunities that we have here, and also because there is some real leadership here with regards to environmental protection, which I am just really personally very drawn to. I grew up in a small mining town in Germany, and I was really lucky because I lived at the edge of town, and almost every day I was able to put my rubber boots out and to go out and poke around in the little hedgerows and forests and fields and ponds. You would see me do that a lot, but unfortunately it's something that we don't see kids doing that much anymore today because our environment has changed a lot. The place where I grew up has changed a lot. A lot of development has happened, some for the...
And Canada's Prime Minister will be among them. So I think it's safe to say that Canada is now back in the game. And as such, tonight, I think it's a really timely and important opportunity for us to reflect on our collective roles and responsibilities meeting the goals of that agreement. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Stephanie Sobek-Swant. Stephanie is the Executive Director of the Rare Charitable Research Reserve, which is a land trust and environmental institute here in Waterloo region. And actually, as an aside, we have one of their beautiful photographs hanging upstairs. So I'm familiar with Rare insofar as some of the great work that they're doing and some of the great photography that's been taken near their premises. It is truly an exceptional place. But Stephanie brings a wealth of both local and international experience on a range of environmental issues. Tonight, she's going to be giving a special presentation on climate, energy, and ecology here in Waterloo region, which, as I said, I don't think could be more topical and more timely. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stephanie to the stage.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Well, as you heard, I'm the Executive Director of REA Charitable Research Reserve, which is a land trust and an environmental institute. Better, some for the worst, and we will look at this a little bit more later as well. But let's jump right into this here and let us talk a little bit about why is conservation important and what can we do. So, I'll start, I always like to start this off with showing you the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Because my dear mentor, Brent Sinclair, he and I, we used to teach a class together about the environment and ecology that was geared towards students of the humanities. And he would always start out like this, and I always thought this was a good segue into this. So this is a really famous painting that was being done in 1887 by a painter. I believe his name was Victor Vatsnov. And really what it depicts is this biblical story about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And these four horsemen are symbolic for conquest, war, famine, and death. And really, if you take this in our context, it translates quite readily into habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation, and climate change, which are really quite as intense as conquest, war.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CIGI, to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Aaron Schaal. I'm the Chief of Staff and General Counsel here at CIGI, and it's my privilege to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to start off by thanking Wordsworth Books. They're one of our sponsors for our signature lecture series. And I'd also like to thank Waterloo Global Science Initiative for their role in bringing organizations together in Waterloo for this week's public programming that's engaging all ages in discussions about our energy choices. And I think just taking a step back for a moment, the way that we use energy, the way we conceive of energy, and the way that we think about it in the broader framework of climate change is certainly forefront at many people's minds. And the work that this organization is doing is forefront here in the region. As part of that, I think many people here know that it's Earth Week. So tomorrow, leaders from around the world are actually going to gather in New York to sign the Paris Climate Agreement.
Death and all these other things this stands for, and some of this can even lead to that, but more on that later. So, well, all these terms, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, they are all threats. And what they are threatening is biodiversity. And biodiversity is actually really important for us humans. And many people think when they hear about the term, it was first coined in the late 80s, actually, by the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. Often people think, well, that's just species diversity. It's just the different species, the varieties of different species that we find in an area. But it's really much more than that, because biodiversity happens or exists on many different levels. It really starts with genetic diversity, which is the diversity within the individuals of a species, the genetic variability in them. And then, of course, you do have the different species that inhabit a certain area or landscape. But then there's also the ecosystem diversity, which really happens at a landscape level. And an ecosystem really is essentially just the sum of all pieces. It's the community of the species that live in an area, but it's also the physical environment of this area and the interaction between